Okay, let's unpack this deep dive. You've brought us a really fascinating piece of history here. John Stuart Mill's essay, The Contest in America.
That's right. Written right in 1862, slap bang, in the middle of the American Civil War. It first appeared in Fraser's magazine.
So it's like we're getting a live report, almost, from this major English thinker watching it all unfold across the Atlantic.
Exactly. And our goal here really is to kind of step into his shoes in that moment. What did he think was driving the conflict? What were the stakes, especially from where he was sitting in Britain?
And what did he see coming? It's so different from reading about it after the fact, isn't it?
Totally different. No hindsight. And he kicks off by talking about something really immediate for England back then.
Right, this cloud that had just passed, as he puts it.
Yes, the Trent affair, a hugely tense situation.
Yeah.
It nearly brought England and the United States to war.
I remember reading about that. A U.S. Navy ship stopped a British mail steamer, the Trent.
And pulled off 2 Confederate diplomats, yeah.
Right.
Caused a massive uproar. Mill is just expressing huge relief that it didn't actually escalate into fighting.
You can almost feel him shuddering at the idea. England fighting alongside the Confederacy.
He found that prospect just horrifying. I mean, England saw itself as the great emancipators of the slave.
They'd spent a fortune trying to stop the slave trade, hadn't they? Blockading the African coast and all that.
Huge sums, yeah. Equal to the revenue of a small kingdom, he says. So the idea of suddenly fighting for the side, defending and trying to expand slavery, it was just morally repugnant to him.
And he worried about how it would look to the rest of the world, right?
Definitely. He points out that, okay, maybe Europe sympathized with Britain's initial complaint about the ship seizure. But if war had broken out,
Everyone would just say England was fighting for cotton, basically. Supporting slavery for economic reasons.
which Mill says would have been a calumny, a slander.
Yeah.
But, and this is key, he admits it would have had too much plausibility.
Why? Because of the general feeling in England at the time.
Exactly. And that leads him into this critique of attitudes back home. He really takes aim at the tone of our press and the general opinion of English society.
He felt they were being unfair to the North.
Very unfair. He says the criticism was almost solely against the party in the right. He thought there was a real lack of empathy.
He uses that striking comparison, doesn't he? Something about a cut finger versus a mortal wound.
Yeah, comparing England's provocation in the Trent affair, a cut finger, to America's struggle, the Civil War, an almost mortal wound. It really puts things in perspective.
It does. So why did he think the English view was so, well, skewed?
He suggests a few reasons. One, West Indian opinions and interests, so maybe lingering connections or sympathies from Britain's own past with slavery.
Ah, the influence of the old plantocracy, perhaps.
Could be. And then he makes this really interesting point about what he calls inbred Toryism.
What does he mean by that?
He suggests that even when intellectually this sort of conservative mindset has to accept liberty, emotionally it's kind of against it. It maybe secretly enjoys seeing irresponsible power exercised by one person over others.
Wow, that's quite a psychological dig at the establishment view.
It is. And he also points out that much of the public anger seemed directed at the rabid and fanatical abolitionists in America, not so much at the slaveholders themselves.
Which seemed totally backward to Mill.
Completely inconsistent with Britain's own anti-slavery principles and sacrifices. He just couldn't square it.
So while he's criticizing England, he actually praises how the American government handled the Trent crisis.
Yes, he was genuinely impressed. He says their manner and spirit in sorting it out raised his opinion of American leaders. They didn't just make excuses, they acted quickly.
And they didn't just say it was politically convenient, they framed it as being the just thing to do.
Right. They said, look, if the roles were reversed, we'd demand the same thing. And Mill sees this basing an unpopular decision on justice as a really hopeful sign of the moral state of the American mind.
Interesting. So even in a democracy, good leadership can prevail, even when it's tough.
That's his take. He sees it as proof that well-informed people being bold can make a difference.
He does mention that footnote, though, about Secretary Seward saying something about self-preservation, maybe justifying holding the diplomats.
Yeah, he wasn't thrilled with that bit. He wishes Seward hadn't added that caveat.
Yeah.
But again, Mill tries to put it in context.
Saying all governments do things like that in emergencies?
Pretty much. He mentions England suspending habeas corpus. So he sees Seward's comment as, well, maybe regrettable, but not fundamentally undermining the rightness of the American action overall.
Okay, so the diplomatic crisis passes. Mill then turns directly to the war itself, and he tackles this idea head-on, the one floating around England.
that the war wasn't actually about slavery from the North perspective anyway.
And Mill just completely rejects that, doesn't he?
Absolutely forcefully.
Yeah.
For him, it's crystal clear. The war is about slavery, period. He says slavery alone was thought of, alone talked of.
What's his evidence? How does he argue that point based on what he knew then?
Well, first, he points to the Southern leaders themselves. They were the ones shouting from the rooftops that slavery was the reason they seceded.
Hard to argue with the secessionists' own words.
Right, and he just dismisses other explanations like the tariff issue. He calls it trumpery.
Trumpery, meaning like nonsense.
Yeah, basically insignificant. He even brings up an economist, Mr. Carey, who apparently showed the South's proposed tariff was actually more liberal than the existing U.S. one. So the tariff argument just didn't hold water for Mill.
And the political timeline supported his view too.
Exactly. Fremont, seen as anti-slavery, gets rejected. Lincoln gets elected specifically on an anti-extension platform on slavery, Mill says. The South leaves immediately because of that. For Mill, the South's motive was just undeniable.
Okay, so if the South was fighting for slavery, what about the North? Mill clarifies their position, doesn't he? Because it wasn't straightforward abolitionism at first.
Right. He's careful to explain that the Republican Party, Lincoln's party, was primarily a free soil party. Their main goal was stopping slavery from spreading into new territories.
Not necessarily ending it where it already existed in the southern states?
Correct. Mill acknowledges the Constitution limited federal power there. But, he points out, they did act where they could.
Like in Washington, D.C.
Exactly. Abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia and even voting compensation for the owners there. That showed their underlying principle, Mill thought.
And this leads to maybe the most crucial part of his argument, why stopping slavery's spread was, in his view, effectively its death sentence.
Yes, this is really key. It's not just politics, it's economics, agriculture. Mill argues that the type of slavery practiced, especially for cotton, just exhausted the soil incredibly quickly.
It wasn't sustainable in one place.
Not the way they did it. It constantly needed fresh land. It had to keep moving west, traveling farther and farther westward, as he puts it.
And he uses evidence from travelers' accounts.
Yeah, he cites Mr. Olmsted, who wrote detailed accounts of the South. Olmsted described seeing worn-out, desolate land in Georgia, the Carolinas, even relatively newer states like Alabama showing decline.
So the system literally consumed the land it relied on.
That's the argument. So if you fence it in, if you say no more expansion,
Then they're forced to change how they farm.
exactly, they'd need to adopt better techniques like crop rotation, fertilization. And that kind of farming, Mill argues, requires skilled labor, free labor, not the coerced, unskilled labor of slavery.
Which would make enslaved people less valuable.
Precisely. It would undermine the whole economic basis, leading, he says, to immediate mitigation and ultimate extinction. Containment equals doom in the long run.
That's a really powerful line of reasoning. Okay, so based on that, Mill then makes a pretty bold prediction about the war itself.
He does. He observes that civil wars often push the sides involved to take more extreme, sometimes higher grounds of principle.
And he predicted early on, didn't he, that this war would become about abolition.
Yeah, he says from the first, he believed that unless the South was defeated very quickly, the fight would inevitably become distinctly an anti-slavery one.
He even mentions that a famous journalist, Mr. Russell from the Times, reached the same conclusion.
Right. Russell apparently predicted it would be an anti-slavery war by the end of the next summer.
And this is where Mill says something quite startling. He actually hopes the war lasts long enough for this transformation to happen.
Yes. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? He hopes it lasts long enough, maybe referencing Russell's timeline, to take on that complete anti-slavery character.
But why? Why wish for a longer, bloodier conflict?
Because, and this is profound, he says, it is quite possible that it will regenerate the American people. He sees the potential for moral renewal through a prolonged struggle for a just cause.
Wow. Suffering as a path to national redemption? That's a heavy idea.
Very. So, while there might have been some initial confusion or debate about the North's exact war aims, Mill sees zero ambiguity about the South's goals.
None at all. They left the Union specifically because Lincoln was elected on a platform of stopping slavery's expansion.
And their new Confederacy wasn't just about protecting slavery where it was. Its fundamental principle, Mill argues, was the indefinite extension of slavery.
He even points to this sort of ideology emerging in the South.
Yeah, this chilling idea being loudly preached, he says, that slavery, black or white, is actually a good thing, the natural state for workers everywhere.
Which really forces the question, what is this institution they're fighting for? How does Mill describe it?
Oh, he does not hold back. His description is absolutely brutal.
Calling it the lowest state of debasement, most cruel oppression?
The type of all hateful qualities. He compares the slave masters to the worst oppressors of the human race, just calls them slave drivers.
And he includes specific graphic details to illustrate his point, doesn't he?
He does. He states bluntly that the institution requires, to keep it going, that human beings should be burnt alive.
That's horrifying, and he backs it up.
He cites Olmsted again, saying this wasn't just a one-off horror, but happened basically every year, not a single year, for many years past.
And there was that specific case he read about.
Yes, from the Edinburgh Review. A northern peddler lynched, burnt alive, just on suspicion of helping someone escape slavery.
Just suspicion.
Yes. So Mill's conclusion is absolutely searing. The South is fighting for the right of burning human creatures alive. For him, it's that stark.
Given that incredibly harsh moral judgment, it's no surprise he then tears into the argument that the South just had a right to separate.
Right. That idea was apparently quite common in England. Just let them go. It's their choice.
Yeah.
Mill calls it a strange misapplication of a true principle.
He criticizes people for being too easygoing when it's about, as he puts it, other people's concerns, meaning the enslaved people.
Exactly. He argues that the desire to secede isn't enough justification. The motive matters hugely. Rebelling to gain the power of oppressing others is fundamentally different from rebelling against oppression.
That's where he uses that incredibly sharp analogy about bandits, right?
Yeah, comparing the South's right to separate to the right, highway robbers like Cartouche or Turpin would have to secede because the laws stop them from robbing and murdering.
It completely demolishes any claim to a noble cause. And he also questions whose will really drove secession.
Good point. Was it truly the majority? He doubts it, especially in places like the Appalachian Mountain regions, parts of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and among German immigrants in Texas, who he says were strong Unionists. These people were basically being dragged out against their will.
And of course, the people who absolutely were not consulted.
The 4 million enslaved people. Mill argues they must have hated the idea of separation. The Union, with the North's growing anti-slavery feeling, was their only glimmer of hope.
Okay, so Mill rejects the right to secede argument. What about the practical argument that the North couldn't actually win or govern the South afterwards?
He dismisses both ideas. On winning, he thinks the North absolutely can win, provided they stick with it.
What's his reasoning?
Simple math, really. The North is twice as numerous and 10 or 12 times as rich. He doesn't necessarily envision a full military occupation everywhere, but rather a strategy of exhaustion.
Wearing them down.
Yeah, exhausting their resources, depriving them of the comforts of life, encouraging their slaves to desert, and excluding them from communication with foreign countries. Basically, a long, grinding siege.
A war of attrition. And he argues against just letting them go early.
Strongly. Because letting them go on their terms would mean giving them huge territories to spread slavery into, plus potentially expanding into Mexico and Central America. It would be rewarding their rebellion with more power than they had inside the Union.
Does he think the war itself might change the South's perspective?
He holds out some hope. Maybe a succession of humiliation or a few significant defeats might force them to accept that slavery will be confined, that expansion is over.
And he makes another prediction tied to how long the war goes on.
Yes, that if it lasts, the U.S. Congress will very soon make up its mind to declare all slaves free who belong to persons in arms against the Union.
He sees that as the logical next step.
As the path to ending slavery completely. He even mentions the possibility of compensating loyal slave owners, which reflects some ideas being discussed then, like Lincoln's plans for Maryland.
And the difficulty of governing after a victory. He thinks that's overblown.
He calls it purely imaginary. If the South is forced back in, they come back weakened, without the territories they wanted, without the fugitive slave law. He even speculates the war could lead to positive constitutional changes.
Like what?
Things that would strengthen its democratic principles, maybe permanently prohibiting slavery's extension, or ending the unfair 35 clause that gave the South extra political power for its enslaved population.
So he sees potential good coming from a Northern victory. But what about the flip side? What if the North gives in or recognizes the Confederacy?
That he calls the worst possible issue. He paints a really alarming picture.
Asking how Britain could even deal with such a nation.
Exactly. A nation founded on, as he puts it, the principles of Attila and Genghis Khan.
Wow, strong language again.
Incredibly strong. He envisions this aggressive new power, its victorious army let loose to propagate their national faith at the rifle's mouth, pushing into Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, maybe even threatening free black nations like Haiti and Liberia.
A nightmare scenario of an expansionist slave empire, and he foresees direct conflict with Britain.
Absolutely. First, over money, he expects them to repudiate debts, even name-checking Jefferson Davis for Mississippi's past debt issues.
Dredging up some old grievances there.
Definitely. But the really big clash, he predicts, would be over the African slave trade.
Because the Confederacy would never accept British ships searching theirs for slaves?
Never. Mill argues they wouldn't allow the right of search, which was crucial to Britain's anti-slavery patrols. It would effectively destroy decades of British effort to suppress the trade.
So Britain's whole moral and financial investment would be undone.
That's the danger he sees. And the ultimate irony. If Britain didn't support the North now, they'd likely have to fight the victorious, aggressive South later, but at a far greater disadvantage. It might even take a general crusade of civilized Europe to deal with the monster they let loose.
Which brings us right to his powerful conclusion, his rejection of easy calls for peace.
Yes, he states it plainly. I cannot join with those who cry, peace, peace.
Because for Mill, war itself isn't the absolute worst thing.
No. He argues that a decayed and degraded state of moral and patriotic feeling which thinks nothing worth a war is worse. A society unwilling to fight for principles is already degraded.
He makes a distinction between different kinds of war, doesn't he?
He does. A degrading war fought for selfish power, like he sees the South's effort. But then there's a potentially regenerative war.
What defines that?
A war to protect other human beings against tyrannical injustice. A war to give victory to their own ideas of right and good, carried on for an honest purpose by their free choice.
And he sees the North's war as heading in that direction.
He acknowledges it's not perfectly or wholly that kind of war yet in 1862, but he insists it has a large infusion of justice, of principle, and that this element is increasing, will increase, and if the war lasts, will in the end predominate.
And if that happens?
Then the war could achieve two things.
Yeah.
Deliver the final blow, the coup de grace, to slavery much sooner than anyone thought possible, and, crucially, it could elevate the North, the free states, to that elevated position in the scale of morality and dignity, because they endured sacrifice for a genuinely virtuous cause.
A cause he clearly believed was worth the terrible price.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He saw the potential for something transformative to emerge from the conflict.
So wrapping this up, we've really spent some time inside John Stuart Mill's head, circa 1862, looking at this immense American conflict through his very particular British abolitionist philosophical lens.
Yeah, it's this raw, real-time analysis. He's hammering home that slavery is the cause, predicting this shift towards abolition as the war aim, utterly condemning the South's motives, and finding this potential for moral growth in the North's fight.
It's just so grounded in that moment, using the information he had, making these bold predictions, these strong moral judgments.
Which really leaves us with something for you, the listener, to think about. How does encountering a perspective like Mill's, written right in the thick of it all, with all its uncertainties, its hopes, its fears, its contemporary biases, how does that change or maybe deepen your understanding of the American Civil War compared to, say, reading histories written long after the outcome was known?